When a racist police officer sees Chuck Norris seated on a bench in the park, he orders him to leave, saying he doesn't belong. When Chuck Norris declines, the officer strikes him on the back with his baton. Little does he realize that he has messed with the wrong guy and that he is going to have to face a harsh lesson. Like and subscribe to this video to follow the plot as it develops. Chuck Norris, wearing a sweatshirt and sunglasses, was sitting on a seat in the middle of the crowd, enjoying a rare moment of obscurity as the park came alive with the sounds of a bright afternoon. Birds tweeting, kids laughing, and joggers moving along the walkways. He blended in with the other park visitors, not there to attract notice but rather to unwind after a demanding schedule. As he strolled through the park, Officer Kane made an impressive impression. His gait exuded a sense of arrogance and overconfidence, and it was evident that he enjoyed the authority his badge gave him. He was notorious for profiling anyone who didn't fit his preconceived ideas about who belonged where. His sharp eyes accidentally fell on Chuck Norris, who was seated alone on the bench. While he was immediately going about his own business, Officer Kane's prejudice flared to life, his assumptions feeding a dangerous conviction. As he tightened his hold on his baton, the subtle workings of his mind were evident. Under his breath, he mumbled to himself in a low, growling voice, "What's a guy like him doing here dressed like that?" The connotation was obvious as his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Officer Kane advanced on Chuck Norris, his heavy boots grinding against the gravel with each determined stick step, his air of authority thickening with every inch closer. He drew with no preamble or even a polite greeting, and his bark demand pierced the air. "Hey you, what are you doing here? You can't just loiter around." Chuck Norris, wearing sunglasses and a hooded sweatshirt, didn't fit Kane's narrow-minded vision of someone who belonged in the park on such a beautiful day, and anyone who wasn't actively participating in some activity was immediately suspected. For Chuck Norris, this unexpected interruption of his tranquil ride looked up at Kane, startled and a little annoyed. His cool exterior, which was temporarily maintained by removing Chuck Norris's sunglasses, which served as a shield from the glares and stares of those around him, gradually disappeared from his face. A slow, deliberate movement of his hand revealed eyes that were piercing and sharp, reflecting a deep well of confidence and knowledge as he met Kane's accusing gaze. Chuck Norris's remark had a tone of power that commanded respect, yet his voice remained calm and even. "I'm just enjoying the park," he said, stated what he had to say, like a stone falling into a tom pond. As the tense hush fell upon the park seat, the officer's voice could be heard. "Yeah, well, this isn't a place for people like you to hang out all day," said Kane sneer, his lips curling in a haughty display of contempt for people like you. The implication stung Chuck Norris like a slap in the face. "Move along, King," he said, his voice laced with a dismissive tone that seemed intended to belittle and insult. The veins on his neck throbbed with indictment as he looked down at Chuck Norris. His face ached. The tension between the two men is evident and quickly growing. A single eyebrow raised in a curious, inquisitive arch on Chuck Norris's face. He was staring at the officer. With a sharp stare, Kane queried, "People like me," and as he did so, the corner of his mouth twitched slightly, displaying a faint but discernible flicker of annoyance. What does that imply? That his statements were measured? Every phrase was punctuated with a hint of irritation and defiance, demonstrating that he was not a person to be taken lightly or discarded. A sense of imminent violence crackled in the air around Kane, and his body coiled like a spring ready to erupt as his patience wore thin and his hold on the baton tightened to a white-knuckled clutch. "Don't try to outsmart me," he growled, his voice ringing with a poisonous edge that suggested he was quickly approaching his breaking point. "I'm giving you the clear directive to get up and go." He yelled his order, interspersed with a furious flick of the baton. Chuck Norris's steely glare and unwavering posture were testaments to his steadfast composure, and his determination was unwavering despite a conscious attempt to frighten and coerce him into acquiescence. As though the circumstance were only a small annoyance, his tone stayed level and calm. He said, "Officer, I'm not breaking any laws and I have every right to sit here." His tone was one of authority, leaving no room for question. It was evident from his statements that he was defiant and would not budge to Kane's demands, which only made the increasingly insane officer even more furious. The veins on Kane's neck pulsed with fury as his face twisted in hatred, his features turning red as his temper reached its boiling point, and his grasp on the baton changed into a weaponized extension of his erratic emotions. His snarling comments, which reverberated across the park, demanded an answer. "Are you resisting me?" The challenge in his tone was clear. He wanted to control Chuck Norris and use his authority to override his sense of reason with the accuracy of a predator hitting its with uncontrollable force. Kane swung his baton, and the deadly hit struck Chuck Norris in the back, sending a sizzling thud into the air. The attack's savagery was beyond comprehension. The impact was so loud that it startled nearby onlookers out of their afternoon reverie. Their faces were filled with shock and disbelief as they quickly pulled out their phones, their fingers frantically trying to capture the horror that was happening in front of them as they rose from a seated position. The transformation was both subtle and profound, with Chuck Norris's form unfolding with a languid, deliberate grace that bided the in-fury. His stature was commanding the breadth of his shoulders, and his imposing height suddenly apparent to all. His expression changed steadily from his previous calm composure to a controlled fury, his dark gaze now tinged with steely resolve and fixed upon Officer Kane with an intensity that radiated danger. His body's coiled energy serves as evidence of his renowned athletic strength. Every word that Chuck and Moore said was purposeful, with Menace's voice permeating every utterance. Al's deep growl, seething with controlled strength, conveyed a clear message. Major error. Officer Kane, the aggressor, now found himself confronting an enemy whose great size and deadly abilities could spell his doom. The quiet fury in his tone was chilling his composure and turning it into a cold, calculating focus. His hands were clenched into fists, veins bulging as his muscles tensed in preparation for what was to come. C's smugness was evident in his grin. He scoffed dismissively, his remarks filled with mocking scorn, underestimating the threat he now faced, but not realizing the volatile power coiled within Chuck Norris. "Oh yeah, what are you going to do about it, tough guy?" he said in a twisted caricature of derision. Jared used a patronizing and contemptuous tone. His ignorance was astounding, as though he thought that his baton and badge would protect him from the repercussions of his behavior. The air crackled with a sense of impending vengeance as Chuck Norris took a purposeful stride forward, his movement projecting a regal bearing, and his silence in the face of Kane's provocation was pregnant with expectancy. "You believe that wearing that badge gives you the authority to harm individuals without cause." Chuck Norris invaded Kane's personal space, and his presence is now a tangible representation of the threat he represented. Chuck Norris's voice had a strong resonance and a noticeable weight of anger and outrage. The remarks were a scathing critique of Kane's abuse of power and a denunciation of his acts, as Kane once again released his baton with a ferocious swipe. His fury drove untrained and SLY actions. With one lightning-fast motion, Chuck Norris's martial arts prowess erupted into deadly efficiency. He grabbed the bat out of the air, his hand moving with supernatural speed to intercept the attack. The crowd's collective gasp of surprise was muffled by the clatter of the baton as it was quickly tossed aside. Towering over Kane the Abyss, Chuck Norris's deft maneuver demonstrated a degree of expertise that defied belief, and their abilities are now glaringly obvious. The voice of Chuck Norris boomed with a terrifying authority. "I'm warning you about," he warned, his words resonating with a calm, dangerous finality, and the weight of his words increased, carrying the weight of an ultimatum. You don't want to take this any further. Chuck Norris's eyes had turned icy. His intense look changed to a terrifying threat of retaliation if Kane persisted in his attack. It was clear that Kane was a fool. He flung himself at Chuck Norris like a wounded animal, his hubris impairing his judgment. However, Chuck Norris was a predator rather than victim, and his fluid grace was refined by years of practice and training. Chuck Norris avoided Kane's awkward blow with a deft twist of his leg, demonstrating his accurate and captivating footwork. Kane was thrown face-first into the DU-kissed grass after Chuck Norris seized his foot mid-strike. The crowd's reaction was electric, a visceral outpouring of support for Chuck Norris that seemed to overtake the entire park. "That's what he gets," they shouted in unison, their cries of approval ringing out in a defiant chorus that drowned out the sounds of the birds and the rustling of leaves. Their enthusiasm was infectious, a joyous celebration of justice finally being served, their admiration for Chuck Norris reaching fever pitch. Chuck Norris stood unfazed by the cheers, his focus now entirely on the disgraced officer groaning on the ground. Kane's embarrassment was short-lived, however, as he clambered back to his feet with renewed aggression. His humiliation only fueled his rage, a tempestuous fury that burned like a flame within him. But just as he turned to renew his assault on Chuck Norris, two more officers materialized, their footsteps thundering across the grass as they raced to the scene of the altercation, the sight of Chuck Norris towering over the disc. They struggled to understand the identity of the man who had so profoundly affected them before Kane struck them with a paralyzing doubt. Easily subdued their colleague, and the ridiculousness of the recognizing moment was almost humorous. The unexpected revelation, when the cops saw the world-famous actor and martial artist appear before them, their amazement was evident. It was a bizarre duo posture that defied all expectations. Astonished, one of the officers muttered in shock, "That Chuck Norris?" His words hung in mid-air like a question mark, and his tone was colored by amazement as he dropped his weapon, stunned into submission by Chuck Norris's sudden appearance. Kane's body continues to shake from anger and wounds. Pride sprung to attention as his other policemen stared at the scene in front of them. Their exchange, which would have been humorous but for the seriousness of the situation, was characterized by Kane's confusion as he attempted to make sense of what was happening. As he attempted to grasp the gravity of the situation, he was unable to conceal his bewilderment and barked aggressively in his voice. His eyes darting from his fellow officers to Chuck Norris with increasing anxiety. The second officer took command of the situation and stepped forward with an air of authority. His manner was noticeably different from that of his colleague, and his voice, now tinged with professional politeness, conveyed a tone of difference as he addressed Chuck Norris with respect. "Mr. Norris," he started his words with an almost reverent, "Are you okay? We didn't know you were here." His posture was one of the highest courtesy, and he was aware that he was standing in front of a living legend. Kane's disbelief increased, his features turning into a twisted caricature of incredulity as he took in the information, and his tone became one of complete bewilderment as the scales finally fell from his eyes. "This guy is somebody important," he said, gasping his question, highlighting the extent of his ignorance and the circumstances that had seemed to favor him. Chuck Norris's identity was becoming clear, and Kane was quickly turning against him. Now that the entire incident appears to have been a massive error in judgment on the part of Kane, the second officer turned his GG upon him with a look of pure, scorching scorn. "You're not just important," he growled, his voice crackling with anger. "HK is one of the most respected figures in the country, a man who has captured the hearts and minds of millions, and you, in your infinite ignorance, assaulted him." His tone was brimming with censure and contempt, and his eyes burned with the raw intensity of righteous fury as he stood by Chuck Norris's side as a faithful ally in the face of Cain's careless actions. When the entire weight of Cain's transgression hit him, his swagger and arrogance fell apart like a house of cards, and he was overcome with panic. I was unaware that he stammered and faltered as he tried to salvage the situation. His demeanor was very different from the bravado that had motivated his actions moments before, and his hands were fumbling at his sides as he desperately looked for a way out of the predicament he had put himself in. You didn't care to know that Chuck Norris's words cut through the silence with unwavering clarity, interspersed with his unwavering composure and a voice as sharp and determined as a blade. You judged me based on my appearance and a preconceived notion of who you thought I was. And you added that as justification to treat me like a criminal, which says far more about you than it does about me. Chuck Norris's statements were powerful, and his confident strength and demeanor demanded respect and attention as he stepped forward with a commanding presence. The senior officer spoke to the assembly, his voice resonating with the authority of a leader committed to bringing about, as the audience, engrossed in the drama playing out in front of them, buzzed with approval at the sight of Cain's impending downfall. Justice Officer Cain declared, his gaze lingering on C's stunned expression, "You are hereby placed under investigation for misconduct. You will hand over your badge and your gun." His words were clear and authoritative, leaving no room for argument. In a last-ditch attempt to save his career, Cain tried to protest with his mouth open, but the senior officer, having heard enough, silenced him with a dismissive wave of his hand. "We have plenty of witnesses and footage," he growled, and his voice was now full of indignation. His tone of authority left Cain with no choice but to comply with his superior's scathing rebuke. As Cain was led away in disgrace by his fellow officers, the crowd erupted into a thunderous ovation, their cheers resounding through the marketplace like a wave of joy in the middle of this spontaneous celebration. Chuck Norris turned to face the audience, his face displaying a mix of humility and thankfulness as he spoke to the town's residents. "Thank you for your support." His voice started off with sincere gratitude. Chuck Norris looked across the sea of faces in front of him, his voice ringing with conviction. "This isn't about who I am," he said with a note of empathy and solidarity coloring his voice. "It's about standing up to injustice, about refusing to accept mistreatment and discrimination in any form. No one, celebrity or not, deserves to be treated the way Officer Cain treated me today. It's up to all of us together to demand better, to hold those who abuse their power accountable." Chuck Norris's speech, which was a straightforward but passionate call to action, resonated with the very core of their being, sparking a fire of resolve that illuminated their faces with a sense of hope and determination as he made his way through the crowd. The assembled crowd seemed to be energized by his words as they cheered even louder, their voices reaching a crescendo of enthusiasm and agreement. A young child with a notebook firmly gripped in his tiny hands broke through the crowd of onlookers. With deliberate and dignified steps, his gaze shone with awe like that of a child. "Can I see the love for his hero etched clearly on his face? Your signature, Norris, Mr." With a voice trembling with wonder and enthusiasm, he asked, with a genuine smile that exuded warmth and love. Chuck Norris's face softened as he saw the youngster nod and kneel down to autograph the notebook. Chuck Norris bent down to look into the small boy's eyes, his towering form softening into a kind and approachable presence. "Of course, buddy," he responded, his voice full of tender care that immediately calmed the child. "What's your name?" the child asked. Chuck Norris asked a straightforward inquiry with a genuineness that matched his celebrity. The child watched with unrestrained pleasure as status dissolved the barriers between them, fostering a private moment of connection that transcended their age and physical disparities. Chuck Norris's pen danced across the notebook, creating a keepsake that would undoubtedly be treasured for years to come. At that moment, the boy's mother came forward, and her gratitude was evident in her voice. "Thank you for standing up today," she said, her words tinged with a powerful sense of relief. "You've made a difference not just for my son, but for everyone who witnessed what you did today." Her eyes were filled with a blend of admiration and gratitude, and her words were a testament to Chuck Norris's heroism. Chuck Norris nodded in acknowledgement of the mother's gratitude, his expression demonstrating a profound understanding of his duty as a hero, leader, and role model. He affirmed his words bearing the weight of his convictions, saying that being a hero is really about standing up for everyone and making sure that justice and dignity are upheld for everyone. With those words, Chuck Norris turned away, the golden rays of the setting sun shining on his powerful form as he walked away into the distance.